The rain in Boston always felt like a cold, rhythmic weight, but today it carried a ghost. 3 years ago, I buried my father, or so I believed. Today, a pristine white envelope sat on my mahogany desk, postmarked yesterday, bearing his unmistakable, jagged script. It wasn't just a message from the grave. It was a confession that threatened to incinerate the very foundation of the man I thought I knew, and the legacy I spent a lifetime mourning. To understand the chilling arrival of that letter, we must first traverse the hollow corridors of a life built upon a foundation of curated silence and the weight of a secret legacy I never truly owned. The morning in Beacon Hill arrived, not with a sunrise, but with a slow, agonizing dissolution of shadows into a uniform leaden gray. Julian Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, his silhouette framed against the weeping glass. Outside, the Boston skyline was a blurred charcoal sketch. The Charles River, a churning ribbon of mercury, beneath the relentless assault of a November gale. The atmosphere inside the room was thick with the scent of aged cedar, expensive espresso, and the cold, sterile air of a house that had long forgotten the sound of laughter. Every object in this room was a testament to Julian's success as an architect, sleek, minimalist, and utterly devoid of warmth. Yet, despite the accolades and the millions in the bank, Julian felt like a structure built on shifting sand, hollowed out by a grief that refused to subside even 3 years after the passing of his father, Arthur Thorne. Arthur had been a titan of the city, a man whose reputation for integrity was as unyielding as the granite foundations of the buildings he had commissioned. But to Julian, he had always been a riddle wrapped in a tailored suit. Their relationship had been a series of polite distances, characterized by long silences and the unspoken expectation of perfection. When Arthur died of a sudden heart failure, he left behind a vacuum that Julian had tried to fill with work, yet the silence only grew louder. Julian's fingers traced the cool surface of a marble paperweight, his mind drifting back to the funeral. The way the wet earth had sounded as it hit the casket, a final perfunctory thud that seemed to signal the end of any hope for reconciliation. Then, the mail arrived. It was a mundane event, the sharp, metallic click of the brass mail slot, the soft flutter of envelopes hitting the parquet floor. Julian didn't move at first. He watched the white rectangles lie there like fallen leaves. When he finally approached them, his movements were languid, almost mechanical. He sorted through the usual debris of a high-net-worth life, invitations to galas he wouldn't attend, invoices for services he didn't need, and architectural journals featuring his own distant face. But then his breath hitched. At the bottom of the pile lay an envelope that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was heavy, cream-colored vellum, the kind his father had commissioned from a specific stationer in London decades ago. Julian's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a bird trapped in a cage of bone. His vision blurred as he focused on the handwriting. It was a script he had seen thousands of times, on blueprints and birthday cards. A sharp, assertive cursive that leaned slightly to the right, as if the words were in a hurry to reach their destination. The postmark was the most impossible part. It was dated yesterday, Boston, Massachusetts, 3 years after Arthur Thorne had been committed to the family vault. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Julian felt a wave of vertigo wash over him. The sterile smell of the office suddenly replaced by the ghost of his father's cologne, sharp mix of sandalwood and old tobacco. He retreated to his leather armchair, the material groaning under his weight. His hands, usually so steady when drafting intricate designs, were trembling so violently that the envelope crinkled. He stared at the seal for what felt like an eternity. The wax was a deep, dried blood red, embossed with the Thorne family crest. "It's a prank," he whispered to the empty room, his voice sounding thin and alien. A cruel, calculated joke, but deep in the marrow of his bones, he knew better. No forger could capture the specific pressure of Arthur S. Penthaway. The T in Thorne crossed with a slight, arrogant flourish. He didn't open it immediately. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in the deepening gloom of the afternoon, watching the rain lace patterns across the window. He thought about the man Arthur was, the rigid moral compass, the civic leader, the father who had once disowned his own brother for a minor financial indiscretion, citing that a Thorne's word was his only true currency. Arthur had been a man of absolute transparency, or so the world believed. Julian remembered the coldness in his father's eyes whenever the topic of compromise was raised. A man who sacrifices his truth for comfort is a man who has already lost his soul, Arthur had once told him. The weight of those words felt like a physical burden now. Julian took a silver letter opener from the desk, the blade catching a stray glint of gray light. With a steadying breath that tasted of copper and fear, he slid the blade beneath the flap. The sound of the paper tearing was deafening in the silence of the library, a sharp, final rupture. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper and a rusted iron key. The letter began without a preamble, plunging Julian into a narrative he wasn't prepared to inhabit. "My dearest Julian," it read, the ink slightly faded, but the intent crystal clear. "By the time you read this, the world will have told you who I was for 3 years, in my absence. They will have spoken of my triumphs and my rigid adherence to the law. But they are wrong. I have lived a lie to ensure you could live the truth. If you have the courage to see the man behind the monument, take the key. Go to the old warehouse on 42nd Street. The one I told you was sold decades ago. The truth is not a pillar of light, my son, it is a shadow that protects." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The warehouse on 42nd Street was in a derelict district of the Doxa place. His father had always described as a failed investment, a stain on the family portfolio. To discover it was still in Arthur's possession was a crack in the foundation of his father's honesty. Why would a man so obsessed with public integrity maintain a secret property in the shadows of the city? The iron key felt unnaturally cold in Julian's palm, its surface pitted with age and oxidation. It was a relic of a different era, a heavy, skeletal thing that seemed to belong to a dungeon rather than a modern estate. He looked at the letter again, his eyes tracing the words, "A shadow that protects." What could his father possibly have been protecting him from? Julian's life had been one of privilege and order. He had never wanted for anything, never faced the biting wind of scandal or the crushing weight of debt. He had always credited his father's impeccable management for their stability. But now a dark thought began to take root in his mind, a suspicion that the gilded life he enjoyed was perhaps bought with a currency he did not recognize. Outside, the storm reached a crescendo, a crack of thunder rolling over the city like the sound of a collapsing bridge. Julian stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't grab his coat or his umbrella. He simply clutched the key and the letter, his mind already racing toward the docks. The mystery of the letter wasn't just about a dead man speaking. It was about the sudden, terrifying realization that Julian Thorne didn't know the man who had raised him. Every memory, every lesson in morality, every moment of paternal sternness was now cast in a different, more flickering light. As he stepped out into the freezing rain, the wind whipping his hair across his face, Julian felt a strange sense of inexorable destiny. The streetlights of Boston flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement, shadows that seemed to reach out for him, beckoning him toward the truth his father had died to keep. The drive to the industrial edge of the city felt like a descent into an underwater world. Julian's sleek silver sedan carved through the sheets of rain, its headlights cutting twin tunnels of amber through the gloom. The rhythmic, mechanical slap-slap of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the cabin, a metronome for his rising anxiety. He navigated the labyrinthine streets of the Seaport District, where the gleaming glass of the new tech hubs gave way to the skeletal, rusted remains of Boston's maritime past. Here, the air was different, heavy with the salt spray of the Atlantic and the biting, metallic scent of decaying iron. The streetlights were fewer and further between, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance across the hood of his car like skeletal fingers. He pulled up to the curb of 42nd Street, a desolate stretch of cracked asphalt and leaning chain-link fences. The warehouse stood at the very end, a monolithic silhouette of dark brick and boarded-up windows that looked like the sightless eyes of a giant. It was a structure that time had tried to erase, yet it remained stubbornly anchored to the earth. Julian killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the frantic drumming of rain on the roof. He sat there for a long moment, his hand hovering over the door handle. His father, the impeccable Arthur Thorne, had lied. This building was supposed to have been sold to a developer in the 90s. It was supposed to be a parking lot or a luxury condo by now. Instead, it was a Tuma repository of whatever truth Arthur had carried to his grave. Stepping out of the car, the cold wind ripped through Julian's thin dress shirt, chilling him to the bone. He didn't care. He walked toward the massive, rusted steel door, his boots splashing through deep puddles of oily water. The iron key felt heavy in his pocket, a cold weight against his thigh. When he reached the lock, he hesitated. The mechanism was ancient, a heavy box of iron encrusted with years of grime and salt air. He slid the key in. It resisted at first, the tumblers stiff and unyielding, as if the building itself was trying to keep him out. He leaned his weight into it, his knuckles turning white, until, with a sharp metallic crack that echoed down the empty street, the lock gave way. The door groaned on its hinges, a sound like a dying animal, as Julian pushed it open. The interior was a cavern of absolute darkness. He pulled out his phone, the LED flashlight cutting a sharp, clinical beam through the air. Dust motes swirled in the light, dancing like tiny spirits, disturbed from a long slumber. The smell hit him, then not just the dampness he expected, but the scent of old paper, floor wax, and something else. Something sharp and chemical, like the ink used in architectural drafting. As he moved deeper into the space, his light revealed stacks of wooden crates, all neatly labeled with his father's distinctive script. He wasn't in a warehouse. He was in an archive. Julian's footsteps echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings as he navigated the rows of crates. His heart was a drum in his chest, each beat a hollow thud of dread. He reached a small office space enclosed in glass at the center of the floor. Inside, a single mahogany desk sat beneath a layer of dust, so thick it looked like gray velvet. On the desk lay a single leather-bound ledger and a series of blueprints. Julian approached the desk, his breath hitching in his throat. He wiped away the dust from the ledger's cover. It wasn't a business record. It was a journal. He opened the first page, the spine of the book cracking in the silence. The entries dated back 25 years to the year. Julian had graduated from university and started his first major project. The Solstice Tower. Julian remembered that time as his greatest triumph, the moment he proved he was a Thorne. But as he read his father's words, the memory began to distort, like an image caught in a house of mirrors. May 14th. Arthur had written, the ink bold and desperate. I found the error today. Julian's calculations for the foundation of the Solstice Tower are flawed. The structural integrity is compromised. If this goes to the city inspectors, my son's career is over before it begins. He will be barred from the guild. He will be a pariah. I cannot let him know. I cannot let his light be extinguished by a single shadow of youthful arrogance. Julian felt the world tilt. He remembered the Solstice Tower. He remembered the rumors that had swirled back then, allegations of financial irregularities and shoddy materials that had nearly ruined his father's reputation. At the time, Arthur had taken the blame entirely. He had stood before the board and confessed to oversight, errors, and mismanagement of funds. To cover the massive costs of the secret retrofitting, he had ordered to fix Julian's mistake. Julian had watched from the sidelines, frustrated by his father's incompetence, never realizing that the shame Arthur wore like a shroud was actually a shield. He turned the pages, his eyes blurring as he read entry after entry of his father's silent penance. Arthur had systematically dismantled his own prestige, funneling millions of dollars into secret repairs and payoffs to keep the truth from surfacing. He had let himself be seen as a failing titan, a man losing his grip, all to ensure that Julian remained the golden boy of Boston architecture. Every cold look, every moment of distance, Julian had interpreted as disapproval was, in fact, the exhaustion of a man carrying a crushing weight for two. "You did all this for me," Julian whispered, his voice breaking. He looked around the room, seeing the crates for what they were, the evidence of a life lived in the service of a lie. There were photographs of Julian at his various ribbon cuttings tucked into the margins of the ledgers. In every photo, Arthur was standing in the background, his face a mask of stoic pride, his eyes fixed not on the building, but on his son. The realization was a physical blow. Julian thought of the years he had spent, resentful of his father's rigidity. The years he had spent trying to outshine a man he thought was flawed. He had built his own success on the ruins of his father's name, never knowing that Arthur had paved the road with his own blood and honor. The conflict raged inside him, a cocktail of profound gratitude and devastating guilt. He had mourned a man he didn't know, and now he was being asked to love a stranger. Suddenly, a sound from the back of the warehouse shattered the silence, a heavy metallic thud, followed by the unmistakable scuff of a boot on concrete. Julian froze, his flashlight beam swinging toward the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing through the hollow space. No one answered, but the air in the warehouse seemed to grow colder, more expectant. He wasn't alone. The secret his father had kept for 25 years wasn't just a matter of history. It was a living, breathing thing, and someone else was watching him uncover it. Julian clutched the ledger to his chest, the leather cold against his skin. The mystery had deepened from a letter into a confrontation. He realized then that his father's sacrifice might have involved more than just money and reputation. As another shadow moved between the crates, Julian understood that the devastating truth his father protected him from was only the beginning. The real danger was still here, in the dark, waiting for the heir to the Thorne legacy to step into the light. The shadow detached itself from the darkness of the far corner, moving with a predatory grace that sent a shiver of primal fear racing down Julian's spine. As the figure stepped into the weak, flickering beam of the LED flashlight, the air seemed to grow even thinner, more suffocating. It was a man whose face was a distorted mirror of Julian's own older, etched with the deep, bitter lines of a life lived in the periphery of greatness. It was Elias Thorne, the uncle Julian had been told was a pariah, a man erased from the family history for a lack of character. Elias stood there, his wet trench coat dripping onto the concrete floor. A sound like blood hitting a stone. Tap, tap, tap. "You were always the slow one, Julian," Elias said, his voice a gravelly rasp that carried the weight of decades of resentment. "Arthur spent his entire life building a pedestal for you, and you never even looked down to see what Torhu was holding it up." Julian felt the ledger trembling in his hands. The leather felt cold, like the skin of a serpent. "My father disowned you," Julian said, his voice cracking. "He said you were a thief. He said you tried to embezzle from the firm." Elias let out a sharp, dry laugh that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. He stepped closer, the smell of cheap gin and stale cigarettes clashing with the sterile memory of Arthur's sandalwood. "Is that what he told you? A convenient lie, wasn't it? A narrative designed to keep the Thorne name pure, while I did the heavy lifting in the mud. I didn't steal from the firm, Julian. I found the flaw. I found your mistake in the Solstice Tower blueprints before the first concrete pour. I was the one who went to your father and told him his precious son was a Froda, brilliant designer who could account for the wind shear on a 60-story spire." The world seemed to fracture around Julian. He gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, the wood biting into his palms. The silence in the warehouse was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of every lie he had ever been told. "He didn't disown you for theft," Julian whispered, the realization dawning on him like a cold gray light. "He disowned you to buy your silence. He branded you a criminal so that your word would never hold weight against his golden sun." "Exactly," Elias hissed, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. "He gave me a choice. I could go to the press and destroy you, or I could take a monthly consultancy fee and disappear into the shadows. He chose to sacrifice his own brother's reputation and eventually his own, just to make sure you could keep your little awards and your clean conscience. He let the world think he was a failing, incompetent old man because he was busy paying off inspectors, fixing your shoddy math, and keeping me in the dark. He didn't just protect you, Julian. He lived a tragedy so you could live a fairy tale." Julian sank into the leather chair, the same chair his father had sat in while writing those agonizing confessions. He looked down at the iron key, now gleaming like a shard of bone in the light. Every success he had ever achieved, the magazine covers, the prestige, the pride he felt when he looked at the Boston skyline, was a stolen thing. It was a monument built on the broken back of a man who had loved him enough to become a villain in the eyes of the world. The psychological weight of it was unbearably a crushing, suffocating blanket of debt that no amount of money or architecture could ever repay. He felt a sudden, visceral disgust for the man he saw in the mirror every morning. The man who had accepted his father's stoicism as coldness, never seeing the silent agony of the sacrifice. And now, Julian asked, his voice barely a murmur, "Why the letter? Why now?" Elias leaned over the desk, his face inches from Julian's. "Because your father knew he was dying, and he knew that a man who doesn't know the cost of his own life is a man who doesn't truly own it. He wanted you to have the choice he never gave me. He wanted to know if you were a thorn, or just another building with a beautiful facade and a hollow core." For an hour, Julian sat in the darkness after Elias had faded back into the storm, leaving behind only the lingering scent of bitterness. The rain continued its rhythmic assault on the roof, but the sound no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a cleansing. Julian understood now that his father's rigidity wasn't a lack of emotion, but the ultimate discipline of love. Arthur had carried the secret like a cross, never asking for credit, never seeking a thank you, content to be the shadow that allowed his sun to shine. As the first tendrils of a true dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the warehouse walls, Julian made his decision. He wouldn't run, he wouldn't hide the ledger. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and gathered the papers. He felt a strange, terrifying lightness, the kind that comes when the truth finally burns away the comfortable lies. He would go to the Guild. He would reveal the flaws in the Solstice Tower and pay for the retrofitting himself. He would restore his uncle's name, even if it meant dragging his own through the mud. He walked out of the warehouse and into the biting Boston morning. The air was crisp, the sky a bruised purple. He looked at the city he had helped build, seeing it for the first time, not as a collection of structures, but as a series of stories, many of them hidden, many of them painful. He realized that the greatest architecture isn't made of steel and glass, but of the invisible sacrifices we make for those we love. His father hadn't left him a fortune or a legacy of buildings. He had left him a lesson in the quiet heroism of the heart. The moral of this story is a profound truth we often ignore in our quest for personal glory. True love does not shout from the rooftops. It suffers in the silence of the foundations. We often walk through lives built by the invisible hands of those who sacrificed their dreams, their reputations, and their peace of mind, so that we might stand tall. To truly honor them is not to remain perfect, but to have the courage to acknowledge the cost of our climb. Ask yourself today, whose silent sacrifice are you currently standing upon? And have you looked into the shadows lately to say thank you? If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the hidden depth of parental love, Please subscribe to Gilded Scraps. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these cinematic narratives of the human spirit. Like this video and share it with someone who might be carrying a silent burden today. Until next time, remember the most beautiful structures are often the ones held up by the heaviest secrets.